And we're continuing with the 8th and final chapter of Mary Poppins Opens the Door, which is called The Other Door. Mary Poppins took the children to the swings for the day, and as they're leaving, they've run into Nellie Rubina and Uncle Dodger, who have given Mary Poppins the gift of a conversation. Jane peered at the letters in the fading light. "Fare thee well, my fairy fay," she read out. "Are you going away, then, Nellie Rubina?" "Oh, dear me, yes. Tonight's the night." Nellie Rubina gave a tinkling laugh as she glanced at Mary Poppins. "You can keep it to eat on the way, Miss Poppins." Uncle Dodger nodded at the conversation. "Uncle Dodger!" cried Nellie Rubina. Oh, my, out of turn again. I'm too old. That's what it is, my dear, and begging your pardon, of course." "Well, it's very kind of you both, I'm sure," said Mary Poppins politely. You could see she was pleased by the way she smiled. Then she tucked the conversation into her pocket and gave the pram a push. "Oh, do wait a minute, Mary Poppins," cried a breathless voice behind them. A patter of steps came along the path, and the children turned quickly. "Why, it's Mr. Turvey and Mrs. Turvey," cried Michael, as a tall, thin shape and a round, fat one came forward hand in hand. "Now we call ourselves the Topsy-Turvies. We think it sounds better." Mr. Turvey looked down at them over his glasses as his wife shook hands all round. "Well, Mary," he went on in his gloomy voice, "we thought we'd drop in just for a moment to say so long, you know." "And not too long, we hope, dear Mary," added Mrs. Turvey, smiling. Her round, fat face shook like a jelly, and she looked extremely happy. "Oh, thank you kindly, Cousin Arthur, and you too, Topsy," said Mary Poppins, as she shook them both by the hand. "What does it mean, so long?" asked Jane as she leant against Mary Poppins. Something, perhaps it was the darkness, made her suddenly want to be very close to that warm and comforting figure. "It means, my daughters," a small voice screeched as a shape emerged from the shadow. "So long, so wide, so huge, so stupid, the great galloping giraffes." And there in the path stood Mrs. Corey with her coat all covered with threepenny bits, and behind her Fanny and Annie stalked like a pair of mournful giants. "Well, here we are again," shrieked Mrs. Corey, as she grinned at the staring children. "We're growing up fast, aren't they, Mary Poppins? I can see that they won't need you much longer." Mary Poppins gave a nod of agreement as Michael, with a cry of protest, rushed to her side. "We'll always need her, always," he cried, hugging Mary Poppins' waist so tightly that he felt her strong, hard bones. She glared at him like an angry panther. "Kindly do not crush me, Michael. I am not a sardine in a tin." "Well, I just came to have a word with you," Mrs. Corey cackled on. "An old word, Mary, and one that is best said quickly, as I used to tell Solomon when he was making that fuss over the Queen of Sheba. If you've got to say something, why not now?" Mrs. Corey looked searchingly at Mary Poppins. Then she added softly, "Goodbye, my dear." "Are you going away too?" Michael demanded as he stared at Mrs. Corey. She gave a merry shriek of laughter. "Well, yes, I am in a manner of speaking. Once one goes, they all go. That's the way of it. Now, Fanny and Annie," she glanced around, "what have you idiots done with those presents?" "Here, Mother," the sisters answered nervously, and the huge hands dropped into Mary Poppins' palm two tiny pieces of gingerbread. One was shaped like a heart and the other like a star. Mary Poppins gave a cry of delight. "Why, Mrs. Corey, what a surprise! This is a treat as well as a pleasure." "Oh, it's nothing, just a souvenir." Mrs. Corey airily waved her hand, and her little elastic-sided boots danced along beside the perambulator. "All your friends seem to be here tonight," remarked Michael to Mary Poppins. "Well, what do you think I am, a hermit? I suppose I can see my friends when I like." "I was only remarking," he began, when a glad shriek interrupted him. "Why, Albert, if it isn't you!" cried Mrs. Corey, and she ran to meet a roly-poly figure that was hurrying toward them. The children gave a shout of joy as they recognized Mr. Wigg. "Why, bless my boots, it's Cora Clary, or it's Clara Corey," cried Mr. Wigg, shaking his hand affectionately. "I didn't know you two knew each other," exclaimed Jane, looking very surprised. "What you don't know would fill a dictionary," Mary Poppins broke in with a snort. "Know each other? Why, we were children together, weren't we, Albert?" cried Mrs. Corey. Mr. Wigg chuckled. "Oh, the good old days," he answered cheerily. "Well, how are you, Mary, my girl?" "Nicely, thank you, Uncle Albert. Mustn't complain," replied Mary Poppins. I thought I'd step up for one last word. Pleasant trip and all that. It's a nice night for it." Mr. Wig glanced round at the clear blue dusk that was creeping through the park. "A nice night for what?" demanded Michael. He hoped Mary Poppins would not be lonely with her friends going off like this. But, after all, he thought to himself, she still got me. And what more could she want? "A nice night to go sailing, that's what it's for," roared Admiral Boom in his rollicking voice. He was striding through the trees toward them, singing as he came, "Sailing, sailing over the bounding main, and many a stormy wind shall blow till we come home again. Sailing, sailing, ahoy there, lovers, hoist up the mainsail, up with the anchor, and let her go. For away I'm bound to go, oh-ho, across the wide Missouri." He blew his nose with a sound like a foghorn and looked at Mary Poppins. "All aboard?" he inquired gruffly, putting a hand on her shoulder. "All aboard, sir," she answered primly, and gave him a curious look. "Humph, well, I'll be true to my love if my love will be true. I'll be true to my love if my love will be true to me," he sang in a voice that was almost gentle. "Here," he broke off, "port and starboard, cockles and whelks. You can't do that to a sailor." "Balloons and balloons," cried a high-pitched voice, as a little shape went whizzing past and knocked off the Admiral's hat. It was the balloon woman. One small balloon flew from her hand. It bounced upon the end of its string and swept her away through the shadows. "Goodbye and goodbye, my dearie duck," she called as she disappeared. "And there she goes, off like a streak of lightning," cried Jane, gazing after her. "Well, she's certainly not creeping like a snail, like some people I could mention. Kindly walk up," said Mary Poppins. "I haven't all night to waste." "I should think not," Mrs. Corey said, grinning. They walked up. For once they were eager to do anything she told them. They put their hands on the perambulator beside her black-gloved fingers, and the blue dusk lapped them round like a river as they hurried along with the chattering group. They were nearly at the park gates now. The lane stretched darkly in front of them, and from it came a strain of music. Jane and Michael looked at each other. What could it be? Said their upraised brows. Then their curiosity got the better of them. They wanted to stay with Mary Poppins, but they also wanted to see what was happening. They gave one glance at her dark blue figure, and then began to run. "Oh, look!" cried Jane as she reached the gate. "It's Mr. Twiggly with a hurdy-gurdy." And Mr. Twiggly it was indeed, drawing a sweet wild tune from the box as he busily turned the handle. Beside him stood a small bright figure that was vaguely familiar. "And all of them make the finest sugar," it was saying gaily to Mr. Twiggly as the children crossed the road. Then, of course, they knew who it was. "Stare, stare like a bear, then you'll know me everywhere," chanted Miss Calico cheerfully as she waved her hand toward them. "Could you move your feet a bit, please, kids? You're standing on one of my roses." Do that again. "Could you move your feet a bit, please, kids? You're standing on one of my roses." Bert, the matchman, crouched on the pavement, right at their own front gate. He was drawing a large bouquet of flowers in the colored chalks on the asphalt. Ellen and the policeman were watching him, and Miss Lark and her dogs were listening to the music as they stood outside next door. "Wait a minute," cried Mr. Twiggly. "Wait a minute. Will I run in and get you a shilling?" Mr. Twiggly smiled his twinkly smile and shook his head gently. "Don't bother, ma'am," advised Miss Lark. "A shilling would be no use to me. I'm doing it all for love." And the children saw him lift his eyes and exchange a look with Mary Poppins as she strode out of the park. He wound the handle with all his might, and the tune grew louder and louder. "One forget-me-not, and it's finished," the matchman murmured to himself as he added a flower to the bunch. "That's dainty, Bert," said Mary Poppins admiringly. She had pushed the perambulator up behind him and was gazing at the picture. He sprang to his feet with a little cry, and plucking the bouquet from the pavement, he pressed it into her hand. "They're yours, Mary," he told her shyly. "I drew them all for you." "Did you really, Bert?" she said with a smile. "Well, I just don't know how to thank you." She hid her blushing face in the flowers, and the children could smell the scent of roses. The matchman looked at her glowing eyes and smiled a loving smile. "It's tonight, isn't it, Mary?" he said. Yes, Bert, she said, nodding as she gave him her hand. The matchman looked at it sadly for a moment. Then he bent his head and kissed her. Goodbye, then, Mary, they heard him whisper, and she answered softly, Goodbye, Bert. What is all this about tonight? Demanded Michael inquisitively. Tonight is the happiest night of my life, said Miss Lark as she listened to the hurdy-gurdy. I never heard such beautiful music. It makes my feet simply twinkle. Well, let 'em twinkle with mine, roared the Admiral, and he snatched Miss Lark away from her gate and polkaed along the lane. Oh, Admiral! They heard her cry as he swung her round and round. Lovey-dovey cat's eyes, cooed Mrs. Turvey, and Mr. Turvey, looking very embarrassed, allowed her to dance him round. What about it, eh? The policeman smirked, and before Ellen had time to blow her nose, he had whirled her into the dance. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, high and sweet. The music flowed from the hurdy-gurdy. The street lamps blazed with sudden brightness. One speckled the lane with light and shadow. 1, 2, 3 went Miss Calico's feet as she danced along beside Mr. Twiggly. It was such a wild and merry tune that Jane and Michael could stand still no longer. Off they darted, 1, 2, 3, their feet went tapping on the echoing road. Here, what's all this? Observe the rules. We can't have dancing in public places. Move on now. Don't obstruct the traffic, the park keeper, goggling as usual, came threading his way through the lane. Mercy me and a jumping bean, you're just the man I want, shrieked Miss Calico, and before the park keeper knew where he was, she had swung him into the mazy dance, where he gulped and gaped and twirled. Round we go, Clara, cried Mr. Wigg, swinging past with Miss Corey. I used to do this with Henry VIII, and oh, what a time we had, she shrieked. Get along, clumsies, keep your feet to yourselves, she added in a different voice to Fanny and Annie, who were dancing together like a pair of gloomy elephants. I've never been so happy before, came Miss Lark's excited cry. You should go to the sea, my dear Lucinda. Everyone's happy at sea, roared the Admiral as he poked madly along. I do believe I will, she replied, and her two dogs looked at each other aghast and hoped that she would change her mind. Deeper and deeper grew the dusk as the dancers whirled in a ring, and there in the center stood Mary Poppins, with her flowers clasped in her hands. She rocked the perambulator gently, and her foot beat time with the music. The matchman watched her from the pavement. Straight and stiff, she stood there, smiling, and her eyes went roving from one to the other. Miss Lark and the Admiral, the topsy-turvies, the two Noahs rolling around on their discs, Miss Calico clutching the park keeper, Mrs. Corey in the arms of Mr. Wigg, and Mrs. Corey's big daughters. Then her bright glance fell on the two young children who were dancing round in the ring. She looked right at them for a long, long moment, watching their bright enchanted faces and their arms going out to each other, and suddenly, as though they felt that look upon them, they stopped in the middle of their dance and ran to her, laughing and breathless. Mary Poppins! They both cried, pressing against her. Then they found they had nothing else to say. Her name seemed to be enough. She put her arms about their shoulders and looked into their eyes. It was a long, deep, searching look that plunged right down to their very hearts and saw what was there. Then she smiled to herself and turned away. She took her parrot-headed umbrella from the perambulator and gathered Annabel into her arms. I must go in now, Jane and Michael. You two can bring the twins later. They nodded, still panting from the dance. Now be good children, she said quietly, and remember all I have told you. They smiled at her reassuringly. What a funny thing to say, they thought, as if they would dare forget. She gave the twins' curls a gentle rumple. She buttoned up Michael's coat at the neck and straightened Jane's collar. Now spit spot, and away we go, she cried gaily to Annabel. Then she tripped through the garden gate with the baby, the flowers and the parrot umbrella held lightly in her arms. Up the steps went the prim, trim figure, walking with a jaunty air, as though she was thoroughly pleased with herself. Farewell, Mary Poppins, the dancers cried as she paused at the front door. She glanced back over her shoulder and nodded. Then the hurdy-gurdy gave a loud, sweet peal, and the front door closed behind her. Jane shivered as the music ceased. Perhaps it was the frost in the air that made her feel so lonely. We'll wait till all the people leave, then we'll go in, she said, and we'll pause there.